Hi, everybody. My name is Stephen Schmidt. I'm a librarian here at Greenwich Library, and I also help to manage our AuthorsLive event. And I really want to thank you all for coming out tonight for this AuthorsLive event, and we're happy to have you here. Before I introduce our guests, I have a few housekeeping details. Thank you for keeping your mask on while all times while inside the library. Please check and silence your cell phone. Now check it again, because there's always one that comes through. And refrain from taking any photos as well during the event. Our friends from Diane's Books are here with books available for purchase in the lobby after the event. And Douglas has agreed to stick around after the show for signing. It's probably a great holiday gift. And we are going to have some time left over for some questions and answers afterwards. So if there's anything you've ever wanted to ask Douglas, now's your chance. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Barbara Hoffert. Barbara is editor of Library Journal, Pre-Pub Alert, which annually reviews 1,500 books 6 months in advance of publication. She also assigns and reviews literary fiction and poetry for the magazine. She is past president, awards chair and treasurer of the National Books Critics Circle, and past chair of the Materials Selection Committee of the Reference and User Service Association, a division of the American Library Association. Barbara reads more books than anybody I know and has a keen way of getting to the heart of a book in both her reviews and her interviews. I've seen her in conversation with quite a few writers, and I can tell you she is very, very good at it. And I can assure you we are in very able hands tonight, and thank you so much, Barbara, for being here tonight. I'll talk about Douglas here shortly, but this event has been a long time coming. And I'd like to take a minute or two to share a bit of history. In early 2020, before the world changed, I walked into my workroom one morning, and my colleague Junko Tanaka, who's here tonight, hi Junko, rushed up to me with a book in her hand, and she said, "You should read this." And so, since I always do what Junko asks, I took it home, and I read it, and then I read it again. I was taken with it for many reasons, but especially because of the glimmer of hope that stays with Shuggie, despite everything he's up against. It's rich characters and beautiful language. So I really wanted to talk to Douglas in depth about the book. So I sent some emails, and an author visit was arranged. Plans were made, dates were set, and we were mere weeks away when the library closed, and all the programs were canceled. Needless to say, we were all very disappointed. A bit later, I got talking with our PR team here at the library about how we might be able to do this interview virtually. This was very early on, and Zoom had yet to become an everyday form of communication, but we thought we'd give it a try. And Douglas, being the good sport that he is, was all in. So, looking back on this experience, it's almost comical now. We were literally like, "Can you hear me? I think you're on mute. Is this thing on?" It's true, right? And I think we had to bail on the first attempt, but we eventually got it together and had a great conversation. And this experience was important for a couple of reasons. First, it gave me and the rest of the library staff the confidence that we could still offer programming to our patrons despite being closed to the public, and we could even expand our reach. And secondly, at the time we did the interview, there was great anxiety, bewilderment, and fear about what was happening in the world. We were still trying to come to terms with things, and it was frankly sort of terrifying. But when Douglas and I began to chat about the book, all those feelings disappeared. And we entered the world of writing and plot and characters. The conversation reinforced a belief that I've had for many years that great art, whether it's books, dance, music, whatever, has the power to transcend and it can help us weather the most trying of times. So I sincerely thank Douglas for his wonderful writing at the time when I needed it the most. And I think we all know what happened afterwards. The world caught up with Shuggie Bain. The build was slow at first, but the word got out, and eventually the awards and notoriety began to trickle in. And then they began to roll in. The book was a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction and the National Books Critics Circle Award. It was shortlisted for the Center for Fiction Novel Prize, and was a finalist for the Kirkus Prize for Fiction. In October of 2020, it won the Booker Prize, and ended up on many bestseller lists, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and really that's just skimming the surface. Douglas wrote Shuggie Bain over a 10-year period and is currently at work on his second novel, Young Mungo, which will be published in April 2022. Born in Glasgow, Scotland, he has an MA from the Royal College of Art in London, and since 2000, he has lived and worked in New York City. And after our initial virtual interview, Douglas mentioned that he would really like to come to the Greenwich Library for an in-person event. And being the man of the word that he is right here. And it's a huge thrill to have you. Welcome. And finally, to Greenwich Library, and without further ado, Barbara Hoffert and Douglas Stuart.
Okay. Welcome to a conversation with Douglas Stuart, the author of I've said it wrong, Shuggie Bain. And many thanks to the Greenwich Library for inviting me to moderate. This is Shuggie Bain's last outing, the last time the author will be discussing the book before he gets to work on his new book, Young Mungo, which is coming out this coming April. Be prepared, and we hope to get in a little sneak preview at the end of this interview, but tonight is a special night because Shuggie is finally saying goodbye. So I'm sure you know Shuggie Bain is the lacerating story of a boy growing up in working class, rapidly deteriorating 1980s, 1990s Glasgow, wrestling with his sexuality, deeply attached to a beautiful mother whose drinking splinters the family. Since publication, as Stephen has pointed out, this debut novel has gone to sell over 1 million+ copies and counting in some 40 territories. It's been nominated for nearly 20 awards, including the National Book Award in this country. It's been optioned for television, and it was a Waterstone Scottish Book of the Year and a British Book Awards Debut of the Year and Book of the Year, and not to mention, once more, winner of the Booker Prize 1 year ago tomorrow was when it came.
1 year ago tomorrow.
So, well done and congratulations. Yeah. So I think we all would like to know first, what is the impact of such acclaim, especially Booker acclaim, on a novelist who had worked so long and hard on his first work and was just wrapping up his second work when this started pouring in?
Oh, that's a hard question to start on. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's good to see everybody again. Actually, I want to interview you. I want to know how you read 1,500 books a year. Is what I think is really what we all want. Really fast, really fast. Well, I think the thing about publishing your debut novel after 10 years worth of work and publishing it a week before the pandemic hits is you really have to let go of all expectations and control. And so I wasn't really expecting it. You know, I had all this hope, and then the pandemic hit, and the book got really quiet really quickly. Mm-hmm. And so I was grieving a little bit the story of Shuggie and Agnes. Mm-hmm. And then everything that followed was just really remarkable, incredible through the year. But winning an award like the Booker, I think, can have quite a muting effect on you. Suddenly there's so much expectation. And so everyone keeps saying to me, you're going to have a really difficult second album. And the correction is actually I'm going to have a difficult third album because my second album was already written. And so I'm relieved for that.
Okay, good. I just like to quote one of your responses to winning the Booker. For 30 years, I've carried a lot of loss and love and pain, and I wanted to really just tell the story of what it was like to grow up queer in Glasgow with a parent who you loved but you couldn't save. So to tell that story, why fiction and not memoir?
So many reasons. I think, first of all, I never felt important enough to base a memoir around. There is certainly a psyche thing on the west coast of Scotland. Certainly with working class men, I think we're often encouraged not to think of ourselves as exceptional in that way. Fiction's also a really great device to take agency over circumstances that in a memoir you can't. You know, you have to render your version of the truth. And what I really wanted to do is, there is a bit of a sort of feedback loop happening, I think. Sorry, the guy just stuck his head in the door. I can hear it. Boo. Sorry, we'll get it fixed. Louder, me louder, them louder. Okay, great. The reason why I chose fiction is because actually I was dealing with a lot of trauma from my own personal youth. And I felt that if I worked on fiction, it was a good way for me to try and understand characters' motivations while also taking myself out of the center of the narrative. I didn't want to explain a really complex world through a little boy's eyes because there was so much happening in Glasgow in the community at that time. And what I really wanted to do was give it over to this chorus of characters and allow them all to tell you a little bit. It's almost like a Greek tragedy, a Shakespearean play. Agnes and Shuggie are on the stage, and you have this chorus come around and really explain the world to you. And I wanted to do that. I didn't want to feel my experience at the center of the book because there was so many things going on.
So this is why you didn't write it in the first person, which I noticed as I was sort of in the center of the book thinking how I was learning about Shuggie and his life kind of by how he was reacting. He was a young kid, so how he was reacting to the people around him. And it suddenly struck me, this is a book titled Shuggie Bain, and he is telling it is his story, and yet he is actually not narrating the novel. So you made a choice very consciously to keep him at a little bit at arm's length that way and bring in everybody else.
That's right. I think if you had centered it in the first person, then as an author, you would have had a feeling or a desire to make everything happen to the boy, and for him to be really at the center of all these things that were happening. And turning it into fiction, although I didn't like what a lot of the characters were doing, how men were acting, why would a mother turn to addiction and away from her children, I at least had to understand it incredibly deeply. And also, it was a very sort of emotional time, and themes like alcoholism and why a woman would sort of give up her hope in that way is not something I think that one little boy can answer. Most of my own life's work, now at 45, having lost my own mother at 16, has been to try and understand not just my mother as the tiny bit of her I knew as a mother, but also as an entire woman, as a person who is incredibly complex with her own dreams and her own hopes and her own losses, that I, as a kid, couldn't have access to. And so in turning it into a work of fiction, you have to imagine the backstory of all these characters. And also it allows you to be in rooms that I was never in. Some of the book takes place in 1943, some of the book takes place in 1970 or 69, and obviously I wasn't born in any of those times.
No, this is true. And what results is of your the mother's experience, Agnes's experience, is a portrait that is both harrowing and also honoring, which I think, again, took a little bit of distance to effect.
Yeah, and I think, you know, distance is a good thing. The book I had a lot of distance with the book because obviously I'm an American immigrant and I'm writing about my hometown, I'm writing about Glasgow, Scotland, but I also have the distance of years. And distance brought me a lot of things. It brought me some longing. It allowed me to commit to this project for 10 years. Part of the reason why the project took so long was very practical. I had a job. I couldn't give up my job and dedicate myself to writing full-time, but also I couldn't say goodbye to the project. Emotionally, I just wanted to write and write and write. And in fact, the first draft of the book was 1,800 pages.
So I've heard. So I've heard.
I know. I saw it the other day and I thought, oh my God, you were keen, is what I thought. But the distance gave me that sense of longing and a sense of clarity. But it also helped me to pull out the human condition at the heart of the story. And although the novel has a very specific setting, both in times of place and place, time and place, it's you know, it's a universal story.
Yeah, this is true. We're going to talk about time and place in a minute, but I wanted to ask you, what was the moment, the impetus for putting down your sketch pad as a fashion designer and finally approaching that keyboard?
You know, I wasn't aware of what I was doing when I was doing it. And in fact, when I began to write Shuggie Bain, I wouldn't allow myself to admit that I was trying to write a book. All I would do was commit to writing. And actually, I wrote a chapter right in the heart of the book first. It's where the two brothers are on the Sea of Slag and they're scrapping for coal. They're scrapping for copper and sort of looking for coal. And from there, I just wrote and I wrote. I felt if I would admit to myself that I was trying to write a book, that I would intimidate myself. I carried a lot of imposter syndrome from the British class system. Who am I as a young working, not young, who am I as someone from a working class background to think I'm going to write a novel? And also, from my creative career in design, I was always so focused on the product. I mean, it is product design. You're always thinking about the finished thing. And I just wanted to enjoy the journey. My writing career was a very private thing for me. And so I just wrote and wrote and wrote.
And those 1,800 pages,
Yeah.
when you finally created structure, was there a structure there, and did you have to pull it out?
I had to, after the first draft, I had to pull out the structure because it came almost to me as these cinematic moments. I wouldn't begin to write what became a chapter unless I could really picture the characters and their emotions and how they looked and how the weather was and how the sky felt. I'd been carrying these images with me for a very long time. And what really sort of happened is by the time you have the first draft, you have this collection of pearls, but there's no string going through them. They're very loose. And so to be really honest, I didn't tell anyone in my life I was writing this book other than my husband. And when I finished this 1,800 pages, I turned to my husband and I say, please, will you read this for me? Will you read this? And he says, okay. And then he begins to read it, and I think I gave him like 4 hours, and I'm like, are you done? And he's like, no. And so my husband's a very generous, very intelligent man. He's been an enormous support to the writing of the book. But he goes through the first 100 pages of the novel, of the first draft, and he's incredibly thoughtful. He thinks of every metaphor. He thinks of the punctuation. And then about page 100, life just leaves his body. You can tell by the quality of his feedback. And he just starts to redact things. He takes a red pen, and he writes in the margin, stop it. Just stop it. Stop doing that. And he doesn't say why. He's just, or he circles it and he says, I love this. And of course, after about 6 months of work, he hands it back to me, and I don't talk to him for 4 months. I feel so violated by this process, because here's something that was so personal to me and only was for me, and so the poor guy couldn't win.
Yeah. So, writing is editing. It's one thing that you learn when you do it, even in the minor way that I have to do it. Writing is really editing, and you've learned your lesson. You did a very good job, I should say. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to something I was going to ask at the end, but about your use of language, and because did you notice that wonderful image that he had of all the pearls, but the string wasn't there yet? This is the kind of writing that Douglas does, and it's absolutely beautiful. I love your language. It is imagistic, it is visceral, it is vivid. It's almost like I could pick it up and rub it through my fingers. The text is just beautifully adorned. Even after all that editing, it's beautifully adorned. So I was really impressed with that, and I kept thinking, where does this vividness come from? I mean, perhaps from your training as an artist? I don't know.
Yeah. My mother taught me to knit when I was about 4 years old, 5 years old. I was an incredibly lonely kid, and I think she just wanted to occupy me, so I'd shut up and leave her alone, honestly. And I didn't know later that knitting would become my career. I have 2 degrees in textiles. But when I sit down to write, for the first little while I'm emulating, I'm aping all of the greats. I'm the people that I admire. I'm trying to be Cormac McCarthy. I'm trying to be James Kelman. And I'm a terrible copy of that. And so what I realized is that actually I've always been thinking about texture. I've always been thinking about the world in a visual way. And so use the skills that I had. And textiles, in a way, made me do that. It made me think about balance. It made me think about the juxtaposition of things that shouldn't sit together. How something, not only when you're describing something visually, but how does it touch, and how does it feel to the touch? And so I just really tried to create this very sensual work. And part of what I was trying to embrace as well is to keep it as quite an ordinary text. Shuggie and Agnes are characters that don't find themselves in literature. And also, they don't turn to literature. I didn't read my first book till I was about 17, not from cover to cover, not for enjoyment. Yeah, and I have to say, a lot of the kids around me didn't either, and I don't think it made us any less compassionate or curious or creative. It's just some communities feel very excluded from literature. We don't see ourselves in it. The conversation's not aimed at us, so we ignore it. And so I wanted to make sure that with my language and with my visual language, with my metaphors, I wanted it to feel like something that Shuggie and Agnes would understand. So when I talk about the daylight, I don't talk about the most magnificent dawn. It's the color of 2 milky tea. Because if Shuggie looked at it and he was like, what does that light look like? Looks like a cup of milky tea.
Yeah, it's interesting because your writing is driven very much by simile, which is interesting because actually there might be a lot of writing teachers who would say, oh no, you should use metaphor. But you work by simile, and that's exactly what makes it so effective, because it does bring together the kind of the unexpected in a way that becomes completely real. Like, and as I was reading, I was making constant lists until I ran out of back pages in the book. You know, I couldn't keep going. And so just to remind you all, if you have, whether or not you've read the book, like feet hitting the floor like bags of heavy butcher's meat. You know, again, a very common, as you pointed out, a common image, one that because I said you could rub through your fingers just like
That's right.
just like a texture of a textile, or the lights at the seaside blinking on and off as though demented by lust. I like that very much. So. Isn't that great? I mean, this is
I'm
just
smiling at my own work.
No,
Sorry.
it's, no, that's good,
I like
good.
that line.
Like,
Yeah.
That's really good. I loved those lines, and so that is something that is actually, I think, strikingly different about your writing. That it is so based in that constant comparison, and I hope you keep it up.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So, as you said, this is a whole chorus of characters, and one of the things that's striking to me about your book is I edit a lot of reviews. This is part of my job, and so many reviews will come up with this. That the protagonist was great, but you know the secondary characters were really cardboard. That's not what happens here. I mean, every one of these characters is quite real, and it's interesting. Even somebody who, like Shug, the husband, who could be a real villain, but he isn't just, and you sometimes really understand his frustration, and that's a really important thing. So there's a very rich range of characters. It is titled Shuggie Bain, and when I was reading it, I often thought this should be called Shuggie and Agnes, because it really does have to do so much with that relationship. And I want a couple of questions I wanted to ask you about that. And one of them, with regard to Agnes, and here she is, she's living with her parents, with her second husband, Shug, 3 children, rock-bottom public housing, but she aspires to better things, and she fully expects to live life fully. And 2 older children are ready to leave the marriage. Shug says when he walks out the door himself, all you're wanting, all you're drinking. And where does that wanting, where do those aspirations come from in Agnes?
Gosh, I think also where do they go?
Well, that's
or
the other
where
thing.
Can they go?
Yeah, because how can she, you know, she
Yeah.
couldn't follow them up fully, which is another
That's right.
thing we'll get to.
That's right. I think I was, you know, part of my own exploration of thinking about how stuck my mother became was thinking about her lack of mobility as a single working class mother living in poverty. How many things were not available to her, you know, leaving school at 14 to go get a job, getting married to the man that you have your first sexual attraction to because society asks you to do that. There's such a lack of mobility there. And when I was writing the character of Agnes Bain, I wanted her to have hopes and dreams, but I wanted her to be very realistic because she wants a front door of her own, she wants clothes for her kids, she wants a little bit of glamour and to be adored. Don't we all? We all want things like this. And yet the world around her thinks of her as being too much, and she's not too much. It's the world that's not enough. And so, you know, her mother at the beginning, everyone keeps telling her, calm down, you know, make yourself smaller. I think when Agnes is sort of talking to her mother about the end of her marriage, her mother says to her, why don't you return to your first husband? He was a good, upstanding Catholic man. And Agnes said, you know, but I wasn't happy. And her mother says, who gets to be happy? You know, just go back, like do the thing. We have to get by, we have to survive. And so I was really just, when I started to write the book, part of the reason why it was cathartic is because I had to consider what brought all the characters to that point in their life. And, you know, I was really struck by something reading Deborah Orr's memoir. Deborah Orr was the head of the London Times, and but she would have been a contemporary with Agnes Bain, a real life woman that would have been a contemporary with Agnes. And she was a working class woman, and she went to university. And when she got to university, she was faced with a statistic that said, of the university group, you know, people who went there, only 0.03% came from the working class. And if you slice that between men and women, I'm sure the number is the tiniest number you can imagine for women. And as soon as you start to grapple with that, you see how stuck people can be. And the novel is so much about abandonment, you know. It's about abandonment not only of a woman by her husband, but it's an abandonment of a community by a government as well. And then also children of their mother to a certain point. And Agnes is facing all of that. And I have like the deepest sympathy for her.
Now that leads me to another question I had. You know, this, so many of your characters are, as you said, stuck. They are under heavy constraint, whether they're trapped in poverty and a collapsing economy, which was particularly the case of Glasgow at the time, with the industries closing and with Glasgow losing its direction, as you put it. They're trapped in the disappointments that they have, trapped in the addiction, or caring for someone who has an addiction. That can be such a painful thing. They're trapped in the social norms. You're talking about the expectations. Well, put up with it, just be happy. And Shuggie, of course, with his sexuality, that brings out the bullies for sure. So every one of these characters has heavy burdens to be carried. And the time I was thinking about throughout the whole thing, were you thinking about this more in terms of that kind of constraint pertaining particularly to these characters and to people like them, just of working class? You mentioned that 0.003% shocking image. Or do you want to also tell us that we all have constraints, some of us more than others, some of us are more fortunate, but we all deal with them? Did you want to tell us that too?
Yeah. I'm always writing about the idea of where do you belong if you don't belong in the place you are, and you cannot leave that place. And I wanted to upend the cliche in working class communities that there's so much solidarity, that we're all in it together. Because there's an enormous amount of solidarity in British working class communities if you fit in. If you're a woman who's a good mother and you don't, have a drink problem and you're not single and you've not got all this stuff at home, if you're a young boy that fits into the narrowness of masculinity. And Shuggie and Agnes just cannot fit in. Agnes has so much self-worth, so much pride, but she's also very damaged. And then Shuggie is a pre-sexual kid. He has no sexual desire. I don't give him that in the book.
Right.
But it's the other boys and the men just, God, you're weird. Why are you like that? What's wrong with you? They say, you're no right. And so it's really about a question about belonging. I didn't want to write a book where just the mother felt she was isolated or the son did. I wanted to show two people who loved each other so very deeply, but they were very separate in their loneliness in that way, if that makes sense. But, part of that comes from my own feelings of never being able to belong. I love Glasgow, but Glasgow didn't love me when I was a young boy because it just didn't know what to do with young queer men in the working class community. And it isn't that Glasgow was a homophobic place, it's the world was homophobic in 1982. But it's had a profound effect on me not ever being able to fit in that way. And I've spent much of my, young life trying to run with the other boys, having some degree of performative masculinity. And I've always been terrified by it, but also terrible at it. And so that sense of trying to fit in is just something that comes through the book. Even Shuggie's family don't, they love him very deeply, but they don't imagine a future where he can be a happy queer man because they just haven't ever seen it. This is pre-so much, it's really recent history, but actually it could be worlds away. And so they also try to change him, and he doesn't, even from my own experience, there wasn't any safe harbor with that as a kid. There was no one to turn to that would just say to you, you are fine as you are, you belong, you are here. And in fact, when I wrote the book, even though it's a work of fiction, and my big sister read it for the first time, she said to me, were you bullied like this at school? Did the other boys do this? And I said to her, yeah. And then I realized, oh my God, I hadn't told you because I was so worried you would reject me as well, because that's what society was doing. And so for her, she had no idea. And so I'm always, it's about conforming and do you belong?
Well, yeah, social conformity is such actually a powerful force in this novel. And you see it happening. Even the conformity to drink is something that brings Agnes down at a certain point when she has struggled out of it. And what struck me over and over again was how many times Shuggie and Agnes kept saying, we could just be normal. If only we could be normal. If only, if you're not an outlier, you could sit there and say, oh, who wants to be normal? Because I want to be, cool. But in fact, being able to fit in the first place is that jumping off place to where you can go. And some people don't have that, And it's interesting what you just said also about a very different time, a pre-everything time, because I noticed in the, and this actually tickled me a little bit in the Booker Prize judge's commentary on your book, and let me just find it because I want to quote it exactly. The book gives a vivid glimpse of a marginalized, impoverished community in a bygone era of British history. And, you know, sort of like the bygone sort of hit me as like, okay, 1980s, 1990s.
Yeah.
I think bygone is like Victorian, you know, something like Gaslight, that kind of
And
thing.
everyone says to me, it's a Dickens novel.
You
and
know,
I'm
right,
like,
it's
not,
something like
you know,
that.
It's
you know?
really not.
And
Yeah.
yet, but in effect, you make a very good point that it really was in that regard bygone, and it made me start to think. One question I wanted to ask you: this novel, the chapter heads have it unfolding from 1981 to 1992, right?
Yeah.
But what if you had set it in 2010 to 2020? How different would Shuggie's story have been?
I think it would be enormously different. A few things jump to my mind there. First of all, you would be dealing with narcotics, I think, or you'd be dealing with prescription medicine. You wouldn't be dealing necessarily with alcoholism. I think the world got a little darker and things got a little stickier since then. But one of the things that is Shuggie's defining strength is and kids can be like this, is he has the comfort of ignorance. You know, all he really knows in the world are the 4 streets that he lives on and the housing scheme. And now this is a bad thing often because it means that his neighbours and the people around him form his entire identity about himself. But it also means that he can face what he's facing because this is all he knows. He can love this woman at the heart of it because he doesn't know better. He hasn't seen the rest of the world. And I think if I'd set the book later, post-internet, post-globalization, Shuggie would know more. He would be able to open some portal and see, God, people aren't living like this, and it would be really difficult for him in that way. So I think about Shuggie's perspective a lot. Also, the working class has totally changed. This is the last gasp of unionized men in the United Kingdom, and so the working class now still exists. 30% of kids in the UK live on the poverty line or below it. That's an enormous amount for the 5th richest country in the world. But I think there's a sense of more individualism within the working class rather than as a whole unified community, and that also leaves people feeling very isolated. I feel like this is the point in my life that I should, or in the conversation that I should say, Glasgow is the most beautiful city.
Okay.
It's no, I mean, you laugh. Glasgow is the most beautiful city. It's, you know, it's my home. I love it very dearly. It has some of the most beautiful real estate, most expensive homes in the country. It has some of the oldest universities. It has real wealth, real mobility. It's also a proudly working class city. And in the Thatcher government, unemployment went to 26%. And when I grew up there, I never saw the nice part of town. You know, some kids just don't have that mobility. It was only 4 miles away. It was 2 buses. But there was nothing to call me to the west end of the city. And that's really when you ask me what would it be like if it was now. Maybe Shuggie would have a bit more mobility. But me growing up, I only knew the streets I lived on.
Yeah. Well, you preempted me a bit because I had a lot of questions about Glasgow, so that's good. You've actually not so much preempted, but set me up for my next set of questions. And first of all, I have to say, by the way, I have it on good authority that Glasgow today is a really cool music scene and a very cool theater scene as well. True?
It always has been.
Okay.
It always has been.
Okay.
But also a plug. See, this is I'm a bit of a Gemini, so a bit of a balance. There's still a lot of communities that are suffering in Glasgow.
Yeah.
I'm often pressured to say everything's great, and the truth is people are being left behind every single day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that would be, you know, you lose whole industries that have been in families for generations, so to speak, father to son to son.
That's right.
In the 1980s, and there is bound to be repercussions to this day, and especially with Thatcher.
That's right. One of the most startling statistics, and also remember under Thatcherism, Shuggie is facing this enormous unemployment number that's affecting all the men in his community around him, but he's also living under Section 28, which essentially outlawed from a government level talking about homosexuality, having any conversations about it in school, any types of other gender identity. And so that's almost nationalized homophobia from a government's point of view. Margaret Thatcher said, you cannot do this. We are a nation of, you know, upstanding families. It's the same sorts of things that were happening. But Shuggie is oppressed in both of these ways, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. But what I wanted to ask you about Glasgow, 1980s, 1990s, what's specifically Glaswegian about your novel? And I don't mean not so much in terms of some of the things we've been talking about, certainly that's important, place, circumstance, but also sensibility.
For me, Glasgow's always been a place of contrasts, and I wanted to bring that to the writing. So it was about putting things together that probably shouldn't always sit together, violence with tenderness, but also sadness with humor. Humor is really important in the novel, and part of the Glaswegian spirit is that when you face something that just feels like it might crush you, the only thing we sometimes have to deal with it is humor. You know, there's a saying that is, you would have more fun at a Glaswegian funeral than you would at an Edinburgh wedding, which just means even in the worst times, Glaswegians are still more fun than the bourgeois middle class. And so I support that now. But there are these things together, and so when you don't have the comfort of money in that way, you have to take life as it comes to you. And so oftentimes tenderness and violence, you can't control it, especially not as a vulnerable woman and a vulnerable child. And then when there's sadness, you try to bring humor to the situation. And I wanted to make sure the prose had that the story also had that. But that's the Glaswegian spirit. There's also a resiliency there. One of the things that you'll never find in the book is someone really, truly feeling sorry for themselves. There's many points in the book that Agnes could have just curled up into a ball and wept for the next 300 pages at any point. And Glaswegians aren't allowed to do that. We have to, like, first of all, part of the story is everybody has a sad story, right? Whenever you sit down with a Glaswegian, you say, oh, but me, this happened to me. They'll listen to you for about 3 seconds, they go, yeah, but everybody's got a sad story. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. It cauterizes a lot of trauma and sharing of trauma, but it also tells you you've got to get up and get on, because you never know what someone else is going through. And so that's also in the book too. I don't address mental health in the book because there was no conversations about it. Nobody sat down and said to Agnes, are you okay? Are you coming apart? You know, what is really behind your drinking, right? What is it you're really feeling?
No, it is never discussed.
Because it never happens. And so a lot of that's the Glaswegian spirit.
Okay, good. And so, all right, now, after that comment about Edinburgh weddings, I'm a little afraid to ask this question. So we've talked about Glaswegian sensibility, but how about the Scottish sensibility more broadly? And I'm asking this because many accounts of your Booker Prize win mention the fact that you were the second Scottish writer to win the prize after James Kelman in 1994, which got me to thinking, so what does it mean to be a Scottish writer? And is there a commonality among your writing and those writings of James Kelman and Ali Smith and Ian Rankin and Andrew O'Hagan and Lila Layla? You know, is there something that is a specifically Scottish way of looking at the world?
Yeah, I think Scottish writing is often incredibly honest. It's very blunt. We don't sugarcoat things, and we try to get to the heart of it quite clearly, I think. And I think that's always, there's an enormous amount of social realism. We have dealt with an enormous amount of post-industrial turmoil, and so we're trying to get there. There's also gender questions in all of these books. But one of the things that I wanted to do with Shuggie, which I hope sets it apart, is when we look at post-industrial Scotland, and so many of the writers you named write about that. If you think about Alan Warner or James Kelman, who's a hero of mine, or Alistair Gray, or Irvine Welsh. They're writing about sort of post-industrial slump, but they always focus on the heterosexual male experience. And I'd wanted to write about industrial communities, but focus on women, focus on mothers, focus on the young queer boy, because these are often incredibly private stories. They happen in a domestic setting. We don't go out to the picket line, to the union line. All the politics are visited on us at home, and they're visited on our bodies often. And so with Shuggie, I wanted almost to push I couldn't do it because it's a very patriarchal place, it's a very masculine place, but I wanted to push men against the landscape and give the stage to feminine souls.
Well, one of the things I can say is that publishing loves nothing more than success. So my expectation is that I will be seeing many more books by Scottish writers now. You're a trendsetter. And more books addressing those communities. Which I think will be an important thing.
I think it's always an important thing. You know, there is still a lack of representation for people from a working class background, or even people writing from a position of poverty. And I don't think we ever understand a nation or a time or a generation unless we can also hear from all those voices. And Shuggie was a book, when he was sent out for submission, my agent said to me, you know, do you want to hear if you get rejected? And I said, yes. I was so naive. I said, yes, it'll make me a better writer. And it gets rejected 20 times in about a week, right after it's. People just, they didn't know how to, I would say broadly, they didn't know how to connect readers, especially American readers, with a family living in poverty in Scotland. And only when I won the Booker and I was telling a journalist, well, it was rejected 20 times, and my agent reached over and said, no, it was 44. I just stopped telling you. And I'm like, sitting there in front of a newspaper journalist. I went, well, you have to revise that as 44. So you said something there that actually is really gratifying to me, because now I see books crossing my desk asking for blurbs that say, if you loved Shuggie Bain.
Yeah.
And so,
no, that's a great,
but that's
yes,
the,
and we're
but
going to see that.
That's the
Yes.
power of representation, and that's
Yeah.
why we have to keep opening the aperture and allowing all these voices in, right? We still, especially, and I'm talking a lot from a British point of view, but it's an incredibly socialist, classist country. Literature still often is centered in London and from a
Yeah.
middle class lens.
Yeah.
And so Shuggie just helps, like many books do, to open that
Yeah.
aperture.
Yeah. Well, one of the comments that you made, someone had asked, had commented to you about your being the second Scottish writer, and you said, well, yeah, there was one Welsh and there was one Northern, someone from Northern Ireland, and that struck me as coincidence, maybe irrelevant, or maybe that has to do with power structures within the British publishing community, which may not have the diversity, which again we're facing in this country today, recognizing that we haven't let in the diversity, and it is beginning to happen, and you, of course, are leading the charge.
Oh, well, I'm one of many. I'm helping if I can. But you know, something really interesting, just another anecdote, is James Kelman is a hero of mine. He is, I think, one of the finest Scottish writers, and he won the Booker in 1994 for How Late It Was, How Late. And I don't know if you've read it, but it's a stream of consciousness of a Glaswegian man who falls on hard times, and if he loses his eyesight after he's assaulted with the police. And when James won in 1994, people stormed out, because James, like myself, writes in a vernacular. He writes from the point of view of the characters. He celebrates the Scots language, a regional dialect, and it's the most powerful piece of writing that actually I think they should teach on every MFA for anyone ever writing a stream of conscious novel. And he burst the door open for me. You know, he really set that. He allowed that, and it's remarkable to see how much the culture moves on in 20 years, to see Shuggie didn't really get any backlash for writing in Scots, for using a regional dialect, for all of these things. But James really did. And so we have to keep sort of pushing. So Shuggie owes a huge amount of debt to James Kelman's work.
Yeah, and it's nice that you're part of that heritage.
Yeah,
that's good to say. And one thing, as I told you before, I was actually really pleased. I understood all of the slang in it. It's very, it really fits.
It's okay if you Google. It's okay.
Yeah, and it does add a richness to the book and to the language itself that I think is really important.
You know, I couldn't write a book that excluded Agnes and Shuggie, and if I'd have received English, if I'd taken the Queen's English, it just wouldn't have been authentic to them. And so, as a writer, whose side am I on? Am I on the reader's side? Am I on the audience who will read the book? Or do I stand with the characters? And so very early on, I had to make that decision. But I knew that readers are inherently curious people. That's why we pick up a book. We want to live lives that we haven't lived. We want to see them. And I think with the Scots, there's a music to it. You struggle for the first, or you take a minute to hear the pattern of it for the first 20 pages, but then it should start to flow.
It absolutely, it becomes part of it. And it actually becomes quite a page turner, I think.
Thank you.
Which I found. And I remember my reviewer described it in his very first sentence as propulsive, which I thought was absolutely true for a book that's also very rich in language, very dense in language, and has a lot going on in it. So I think having it be a page turner as well is an accomplishment. But so in terms of all those, you're absolutely right. People want to read about other worlds, and we want to learn about other worlds. And I remember reading again that I didn't know it was 44. I thought rejections. I thought it was only 30. But then look where you ended with actually one of my favorite presses. So I'm very happy that worked out. But one of your agents said, "Who wants to read about a working class Scottish boy and dealing with a mother who has an addiction to alcohol?"
It can be a hard strap line to get people.
When you just sort of start there, but the answer has turned out to be pretty much everyone. If you look about that million plus, pretty much everyone, and why not? Because in fact we can identify, and that is that it represents a community. It gives that community voice. and it lets us into a community who didn't grow up there, and really understand something. And that's an important dual role that the book can play, and books like it can play.
Thank you.
So I think it's important. So let me just end. I think we have just a few more minutes left. Quickly, it's been optioned for TV. It's an American company that optioned it, but I'm hoping it's going to be filmed in Glasgow.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
It absolutely must be.
Yeah.
So we never know if these things will make the screen. These things happen all the time, but I'm currently writing the scripts for an 8-episode arc, which is going to be directed by Stephen Daldry, who did The Crown. So he's going from all ends of the social spectrum.
Yeah.
But it might never make the screen. If anyone's got a couple of $1 million kicking around, see me after the show, a television production company, but you never know. So I can't say it's going to happen, but it's been fun to work on. And actually, I couldn't let go of Shuggie and Agnes, so I had to sign on to write the scripts, because but the really fascinating thing is when the medium changes, the characters change. And so when you have to tell the story in a slightly different way, Agnes is telling me things she never told me before. And I'm kind of like, shut up, we can't go on this journey right now. I don't say that, but it's been a really fun, fascinating process.
Okay, no, that's great. We'll look forward to it. Production starting in 2022?
We don't know. We don't know. I'm not
okay.
keeping.
Okay.
Keeping it. I
All right,
honestly
all right.
don't know.
Well,
Production might never start. Is
No,
another thing.
no, we're hoping. Okay, and now finally, a sneak peek at Young Mungo.
Yeah. So I'm so excited. My next novel publishes in April. It is called Young Mungo. Mungo is the patron saint of Glasgow, for anyone who doesn't know him, and he founded the city with 4 very childlike, innocent miracles. He's a very benevolent figure. But my Mungo is also a benevolent figure, and he's a 15-year-old boy growing up in 1990s Glasgow. But there's so much feedback. I think that might be you coming to me.
Sit back.
Yeah, sit back. But Mungo is a young man in 1990s Glasgow, and he has been pulled into petty crime and gang violence by his siblings. I don't know what that is. But maybe it's the mics at the back. But he's been pulled into petty crime and gang violence by his older brother. And his older brother is the leader of the local Protestant gang. And Mungo does the one thing that you shouldn't do when your older brother's the leader of the local Protestant gang, and he falls in love with a young Catholic man. And so it's about masculinity, it's about performative masculinity, it's about how we used to believe the safest place for young boys was around men, and how sometimes that's not the best place for young boys. But it's really, for me, at the end of Shuggie Bain, I'd left Shuggie on the brink of manhood, and I didn't want to give him a love affair because his love of his life is his mother. For Shuggie, that's the love of his life. But it left me with a desire to go back and look at 2 young working class men who are really trying to fit in and belong where they are when it's quite hostile to them.
So not a sequel, and yet continuing an exploration.
Yeah, I think I'm writing about the cycles of man in a way from my lens. And so you can imagine Mungo and Shuggie rubbing against each other, glancing, their lives coming together, but it's not a sequel. I think we'll leave Shuggie and Agnes where they are.
Okay, all right, that's good. Now before, we have an opportunity to have questions, but beforehand we have a big treat. We're going to have a reading from Douglas.
So this actually is from the center of the book. And for anyone who's read it, for anyone who hasn't read it, Agnes, after being abandoned by her husband, has, she's sank into addiction, into alcoholism. But she has met a new man, and she has fallen in love, and she's going on her first date in a few years. But she turns to Shuggie to ask him to teach her how to dance like kids today dance, 'cause she's a bit nervous to go to a nightclub. But it's possible that Shuggie is the wrong kid to ask that of. It's definitely very likely he's the wrong kid. Dance for me, Hugh, said Agnes out of the blue. Eh? Answered Shuggie, rolling over on the carpet. Leek groaned. He didn't like it when she made a pet of his brother. What good was a soft boy in a hard world? He left them to their nonsense, and they listened to him slam his bedroom door and knew he would be hunched over, his heavy headphones on, drawing again in his black sketchbook. Go on, dance for me. I want you to show me how kids today dance. Agnes put a cassette in the deck of the stereo. As she pulled her beaded jumper down over her thighs, he could see her mind was elsewhere. Well, you stand a bit like this. He opened his feet to hip width apart. And then he started to wiggle his bum. Agnes copied him. Like this? It looked more natural on her, on a woman. Then you have to shake your shoulders and move your hands just a little bit. He began a jerky shoulder shimmy, like one he had seen on the telly, done by a black singer with shoulder pads and a pineapple-shaped mohawk. Then do this a little bit, he said, moving faster and faster, swinging his palms wide in opposite rotation to his hips, a bit like a skier, a bit like an epileptic. Like this, she asked, looking like she was having a stroke. Well, maybe. He was not entirely convinced. Do this next. And he jerked like a robot and jumped forward and back like he was stamping out a fire. Agnes tried it, and all the glass ornaments in the cabinets tinkled. Are you sure this is how young ones dance the day? She said, already flushed from the routine. Oh, aye, said Shuggie, shimmying his shoulders lower to the ground, placing his hands on either side of his head like he had a headache. He had just taught her the routine to Janet Jackson's Control. I'm needing to rest for a wee minute. She collapsed onto the settee and picked up her cigarettes. You keep dancing, though, and I'll keep watching. I want to be a good dancer when I go up the town with Eugene. Eugene? Shuggie felt tricked. If he'd known that, he'd have taught her the zombie dance to Thriller instead. That would have shown her. But the song changed, and Shuggie kept dancing. His hands burst open like fireworks, and his head flicked as though he had long, sexy hair. He dipped and popped, using his hips too much for a boy, and he emoted along with the song like it was a grand opera and not a 3-bar pop factory hit for 13-year-old girls. Brilliant. What a smooth mover, she said. I'm going to do this all up the dancing next week. Eugene will just die. Just you wait. He was enjoying her attention, and something inside him flowered, and he started popping his body like he'd seen the black boys on telly do. The self-consciousness left him, and he spun and shimmied and shook in all the telly ways. He was mid-cat's leap when he let out a sharp scream. It was high-pitched and womanly, the same shriek he let loose when Leek leapt out of the dark at him. He hadn't seen them at first, and he would never know how long they had been there, but across the street, in the window of the front room, stood the McAvenis. They pressed against the large glass window, and they were gutting themselves with laughter. The window throbbed as they beat their hands against it with glee, and Dirty Mouse did a little sexy, girlish pirouette. Shuggie realized that was him. He looked at his mother. When had she noticed? She only looked up at him and took a draw on her fag. Without glancing out the window, she spoke to him through clenched teeth. If I were you, I would keep dancing. I can't. The tears were coming. You know they only win if you let them. I can't. Don't give them the satisfaction. Mammy, help. I can't. Yes, you can. She was still smiling. Just hold your head up high and gie it laldy. She was no use at maths homework, and some days you could starve rather than get a hot meal from her. But Shuggie looked at her now and understood that this was where she excelled. Every day, with the makeup on and her hair done, she climbed out of her grave and held her head high. When she disgraced herself with drink, she got up the next day, put on her best coat, and faced the world. When her belly was empty and her wains were hungry, she did her hair and let the world think otherwise. It was hard at first to start moving again, to feel the music, to go to that other place in your head where you keep your confidence. It didn't go together, the shuffling feet and the jangly limbs. But then, like a slow train, it caught speed and he was rolling again. He tried to tone down the big showy moves, the shaking hips and the big sweeping arms, but it was in him, and as it poured out, he found he was helpless to stop it. Thank you.
There you go.
We have a few minutes for some questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask Douglas?
Sure you do. Come on.
Oh, there's a hand over here.
Okay.
Can I take this down for a second? I just want to say, I'm halfway through the book. I think it's terrific. And I have spent quite a lot of time in Glasgow during that period, actually. The thing I wanted to ask you that I was sort of unsure about, because I'm obviously, not from there, is what I have an understanding is really that doesn't seem to come into the book that much, is about the sectarianism, and I was confused. I assumed that they were they were Catholics, and they didn't. I thought there was more tension between those communities, and I don't know whether it comes later in the book, but I didn't see that reflected. I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that kind of background between the Protestants and the Catholics in Glasgow.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Well, the divide between Catholics and Protestants is as old as the Reformation. It goes all the way back. But Glasgow is on the west coast of Scotland, and when the city was booming at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, we had a lot of Irish immigration because the Irish were starving, and so they came for work. But like many immigrant communities, they were isolated and they were ghettoized. And they did a thing where they often worked for less than the unionized wages. So there was an awful lot of animosity there as well. I am both Catholic and Protestant. My mother's side of the family comes from Donegal. But sectarianism in the city is something that's really hard to explain. It's something that's often just there. It only tends to affect the working class communities and tends to affect working class men. And if you ask them why there's a division like that, sometimes they can't express it. It's just, it's tribalism in a way. But from my experience, my grandparents didn't come to my parents' wedding because it was a taboo to marry a Protestant, to marry a Catholic, if you weren't of that. And sectarianism in the city can have lots of different frequencies. We sometimes think of it as banter, but other people hear it and it sounds like hate talk. You say things that are very sharp towards the other people. We're obviously separated at school. There's two football teams that dominate a lot of culture in the city. One is Glasgow Celtic, one is Glasgow Rangers. One is Catholic, primarily historically, one is Protestant. And in fact, Rangers only had their very first Catholic player in 1992, 1993. And that's after 100 years history. Glasgow also has the second largest Glasgow also has the second largest Orange Pride March outside of Belfast. And so you understand what sectarianism does in Belfast, how it's tied to big questions about identity, and how it's very, very violent. It's never that violent in Glasgow, and it's not really tied to those questions of identity, because I think if you cut the working class men through the middle, they would all say, but we're Scottish. It's not about being British or Irish, it's about we're Scottish. But it does often give people who are marooned in communities that feel very isolated something to do, a team to root for, a way to identify themselves. Oftentimes young men pitch themselves into opposing gangs, and it gives you someone to fight. And so it becomes that kind of thing. But my second novel actually is squarely about sectarianism. And so it's one of those things that's just another flavor of the city.
That's true. It surprised me. I had not expected to see that when I was reading.
I've been thinking a lot about it because obviously we're facing big divisive questions in the world all the time at the moment. And when I think back about sectarianism, it seems so futile in Glasgow because we were identical. We were socio-economically the same. We might have been a couple of streets away from each other. Oftentimes we played together as kids and we ran around together. There was lots of mixed marriages. And yet at the same time, if that young man wanted to use it as a point of division, he could. And so it's fascinating to me.
True as well. Are there more questions?
There's a lady here.
Right over here. We have a mic coming down to you.
Do you have a question? I loved the book. I just thought it was a very, very raw, compelling read. I just couldn't put it down. And being Welsh, I could sort of relate to some of the growing up times too. I was really impressed by what a proud woman Agnes was. And I'm wondering about, there were times when I wanted to run after you, there were times when I wanted to pick you up and hug you. And I'm wondering what you did with all those feelings and how cathartic writing this last 10 years has been for you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I'll take a hug anytime as well, just so you know. You know, I don't know that it is cathartic, because I don't know that you get to give away trauma. I don't know that you get to sort of ever exercise it. I think you just carry it your whole life. One of the things that the book did for me is, and I answered it poorly at the beginning, is it deepened my empathy. I think when you suffer a lot of things as a kid, whether that's addiction, loss of addiction, vulnerability, homophobia, bullying on a daily basis, it's all trauma that's happening to you. And when you decide to write a work of fiction, you have to consider why people do that. You might not like why they do it, but you have to sit down and think, God, what got these people to that place? And when I did that, it gave me a much broader perspective, and it brought me to a place, even for some of the men in the books, even the fathers that abandon children and do terrible things, it got me to a place not where I liked it, but I could at least say I understand it. And so that for me was really healing, and I think that was my journey over 10 years. But I was on stage with Edward Louis recently, who writes a lot about his own mother, and we just realized, you know, what I wanted to do with the character of Agnes. We realized that we spent most of our adult lives trying to understand our mothers. You know, maybe it's a queer son's curse. Maybe that's what we're always doing. But what I wanted to do with Agnes was not have her just be a mother as a character. That's why when you first meet her, you don't meet her kids till later. Because I think sometimes when a woman becomes a mother, that's almost her biggest thing, but it's also what the community pins on her. It's what they blame her for. You're not a good mother. How can you fail your kids? How can you do that? And I wanted always to have the reader look beyond that role that she plays, because she's also a daughter, a woman, a friend, a foe. You know, she's a lover. She's a spurned wife. And I wanted to try and see the hurt at the heart of the woman. And so I wanted to show her as multifaceted. And that was a really cathartic thing for me, to think of this character, who's not my own mother, but to think of my mother and her sort of parallel and sort of come to understanding. Thank you.
More?
Yes, thank you. I wondered also, as you're speaking about Agnes and Shuggie, but about his siblings too, and if you sort of, that empathy for your siblings, or just if those characters took you places you didn't expect, and how the art also of his brother specifically sort of wove its way into that story.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things about the 1,800-page first draft is we spend a lot more time with the siblings, and I had to almost pare the lens back and make Shuggie the star of the show, or make Agnes the star of the show. But the siblings, for me, were about a central question of, I don't know if anyone's ever had addiction in their lives or with someone that they love, but oftentimes there comes a question when someone is chronically addicted and they can't get better over years and years, where people have to come to the conclusion of, how far do you go to save the person you love before you have to save yourself? And sometimes people have to step away from a person who's suffering with addiction. And so in a way, Catherine and Leek are about compounding that pressure on Shuggie and having different perspectives. You know, Catherine escapes quite quickly and goes off to make her own life, but she probably makes the same mistakes that Agnes made, where she didn't, you know, follow her own dreams and her own passions, but she marries and she's taken to the other side of the world. And then Leek for me was like Jude Foley from Jude the Obscure. He's a symbol of two things. He's the young working class man that's trying to build a better life for himself, but he can't worry about 4 years in the future when you've got to worry about today and your mother and your brother. And so he's stuck, and that's a story that's as old as time, I think, for many people. But Leek is also a manifestation of my own anxiety. You know, my mother died when I was 16. And I spend a lot of my adult life thinking, where would I be if she hadn't? You know, would I still be beside her? Would I still, you know, be trying to help her? And where would I be? And so Leek, in a way, is answering that for me, if that makes sense to you. But yeah, the siblings are... One of the things that through my own journey is when a mother has 3 kids, she has 3 different kids, but you also have 3 different mothers, because you come into her life at different times and you see different perspectives. So I also wanted to use the siblings as a device for perspective. Leek sees something very different than Shuggie sees. Shuggie just loves and accepts because he has no context. But Leek maybe knew the woman before she had fallen that far, and he feels stuck. He's more mature. And so he's harsher on his mother.
We have one more question.
Sorry, I rambled on.
I love the book so much. I cried through big chunks of it, and also wanted to hug you and just say I love you so much for it all, and such empathy for your mother. This isn't really about the book, but I was just curious, knowing how our conversation about gender identity and addiction has changed so much, even recently, how you think boys that grow up now in working class families that could be identified differently, how you think it's better, or your opinion on that. And I'm just curious what you think of how it is today versus how you wrote for a boy. Like, I'm going to say Shuggie. I've been saying Shuggie, and I am sorry.
That's all right. He doesn't mind. You know, the truth, one of the things that the book taught me is, you know, you can write from personal perspective, but publishing it around the world has taught me that there are so many Shuggies and Shuggettes that went through that experience. It could be Naples, it could be Detroit, it could be Connecticut. I mean, it was just the world didn't have much safe harbor for young queer people in the 80s. And nobody knew a better way to be. It wasn't that society was homophobic, it's just that we didn't know. And so I give people a lot of credit for that. You know, I think it's better in young working class communities because I think, as we'd spoken about, people have connections. You can find a tribe now, whether it's digitally, without having to leave where you are. But when I was a kid, I was made to believe that I was the only person like that. And there might have been people on the other streets, but they just, you know, no one would identify as that. And so it was incredibly lonely. And it was a lot of my work as an adult man to try and build my own community and not feel as lonely as that. And so Shuggie just, you know, he's incredibly isolated in that way. And so I want to say everything's better, but then I also support the Ali Forney charity in New York. And I know kids are still being made homeless on a daily basis when they come out as queer or they come out as having a different gender identity. And that's the most liberal city in the world. So, you know, I think it's probably a bit of both.
It's been a while, so I'm sorry. It's a bit vague, but there's the grandmother has a baby, and that I wonder if there was more of that in the 1800 pages because it seemed like that bit was it was in there, but there was so much going on, and I'm not sure why it was in there or whether that's going to come out more later in something or. Yeah.
No, it was exactly as it was meant to be. There was a question about the grandmother and her baby. You know, the reason why that chapter is in there is because Lizzie has been quite harsh on Agnes and sort of doesn't like how her daughter conducts herself. And really there's an echo between Shuggie at the very beginning of the book and then his mother. He learns a lot from his mother if you see how he is with that older gentleman in the bedsit, and then also how Lizzie is. And the truth is that's me without putting any morals on it, saying when the chips are down and you're struggling, nobody knows what they're going to do. And so it shows Lizzie almost to be a hypocrite. She's gone through a difficult time. But the reason for the abruptness for the baby, and the reason why I'll never tell you what happened to the baby, is because sometimes people can't afford to be sentimental. You've got to crack on. There is no way that a Catholic man was going to come back from war in such a close-knit community where the community knew about the baby and help raise some other man's kid. It wouldn't have been tolerated. I mean, this is a time also, remember, when women and their babies in the young mothers' homes in Ireland were being very ostracized. You know, there's religion in this book. And so that's the story. I'll leave what happens to the baby to your imagination, but I will say I think fundamentally Willie is a good man, so take hope in that.
Thank you, everybody, for coming up. Barbara, Douglas, thank you. It's been wonderful.
Big applause for Douglas.
Real quick, this series is made possible through the support of the Greenwich Library Board of Trustees and contributions by generous donors. Thank you, and Douglas will be out signing some books here in a few minutes. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you so much.